The birth of Kogal, how Japanese schoolgirls broke the rules and built an empire. In 1996, Japanese schools started banning a pair of socks. Not weapons, not phones, socks. Because those socks, bunched up, sagging around the ankle, sometimes glued to the skin so they wouldn't slip, had become the uniform of a movement that adults in Japan genuinely did not know how to control. Girls as young as 15 were reshaping their school uniforms into something the Ministry of Education never approved. By the time anyone in power figured out what was happening, it was already a national obsession, a media panic, and a billion-yen industry. This is the story of Kogal. And if you like deep dives into the culture history book skip over, hit subscribe now, because this channel exists to dig up exactly this kind of thing. So here's the question that actually matters. How did a handful of Tokyo teenagers manage to terrify a country? To understand that, you have to go back to the early 1990s, right after Japan's economic bubble burst. For decades, Japan had run on a certain formula. Work hard, follow the rules, don't stand out, and the system rewards you. Then the bubble popped, the lost decade began, and that promise quietly broke. The adults who'd built their whole identity around conformity were suddenly watching companies collapse and salaries freeze, and their daughters were watching too. Somewhere in that gap, in the shopping streets of Shibuya, a new kind of teenager appeared. She wore the same mandatory school uniform as every other girl in the country, but she'd taken scissors to the skirt and dyed her hair a shade of brown that definitely wasn't on any approved list. She traded her stiff, standard socks for something loose, oversized, and completely against code. They called her a kogyaru, short for kokosei-gyaru, literally high school gal. English speakers would later shorten it to Kogal. And here's the part that surprises people. This wasn't a fashion brand's idea. Nobody in a boardroom designed this look and sold it to teenagers. It started as an organic street movement, built by the girls themselves in the exact neighborhood where it would explode. That neighborhood was Shibuya, specifically the area around Shibuya 109, a fashion building that would soon become ground zero for an entire subculture. Now, picture the visual for a second, because it's oddly specific. A shortened, pleated skirt and an oversized cardigan worn loose. Skin darkened with bronzer or tanning salons, which was itself a rebellion. Pale, untouched skin had been the Japanese beauty standard for generations. Bleached or honey brown hair, and those socks, sometimes stretched out to nearly 2 meters long before being scrunched down into a thick donut around the ankle. Some girls used actual glue to keep them from sliding. Every piece of it was a small, deliberate act of defiance. Not loud rebellion, and not punk rock. Just quiet, coordinated disobedience, repeated by thousands of girls at the same time, in the same place, until it stopped looking like rule-breaking and started looking like a uniform of its own. By 1995, this had a media machine behind it, with a magazine called Egg launching that year. It did something no fashion magazine had really done before. It didn't hire professional models. It photographed actual high school girls on the actual streets of Shibuya and put them on the cover. Suddenly, being photographed for Egg wasn't something that happened to you. It was something you dressed for. Girls started competing, subtly, over whose socks slouched more perfectly, whose skirt hit the exact right length. It became a whole economy of small details, and everyone in it knew the rules, even though nobody had written them down. And that's when it stopped being a Shibuya thing and started becoming a Japan thing, spreading to Osaka and then to smaller cities. Schools panicked and started banning loose socks outright, which, if you know anything about teenagers, is basically rocket fuel for a trend. But here's the turn nobody was expecting. as Kogal exploded into the mainstream, something darker attached itself to it. And it wasn't something the girls who started the movement asked for. In the mid-1990s, Japan became gripped by a moral panic around something called enjo-kosai, or compensated dating. This was where older men paid teenage girls for their company, sometimes escalating into something much worse. The media needed an image to put on the cover of that story. The Kogal look, the short skirt, the tan legs, the loose socks, became the visual shorthand for it, whether it was accurate or not. A 1996 book about the phenomenon literally put a girl dressed exactly like a kogyaru on its cover. Here's the uncomfortable truth researchers found later. The actual kogyaru, the ones at the center of the original Shibuya scene, weren't the primary group involved in enjo-kosai. A doctor who spent years counseling teenage girls in Tokyo said plainly that gyaru girls had too much pride for that. But it didn't matter, because the image had already been locked in the public imagination. An entire generation of girls who were mostly just experimenting with fashion, identity, and rebellion got painted with a scandal that belonged to a much smaller group. That's the part of this story that usually gets left out. The way a fashion movement built by teenage girls, for teenage girls, got hijacked by adult media into a story about danger and morality. It happened fast, and almost entirely without the girls' consent over their own image. And yet, the culture didn't die. It transformed. Brands like Me Jane and Love Boat started designing specifically for this market. Purikura photo booths, those sticker photo machines, became a cultural obsession, partly fueled by Kogal girls documenting themselves and their friend groups. Shibuya 109 rebuilt its entire identity around this demographic and became one of the most influential youth fashion hubs on the planet, a status it still holds decades later. By around 1998, the specific peak of the loose socks era started to fade. Not because the girls got bored, but because it had become too mainstream. Every school uniform shop was selling them, and every mall had a version. The exact thing that made it feel rebellious in 1994, being something only a small, specific group of Shibuya girls understood, was gone by the time everyone's little sister was wearing it too. But the DNA never disappeared, evolving into the broader gyaru movement. This included ganguro, with its extreme tans and platinum hair, and later, softer, more polished substyles. If you walk through Shibuya today, you can still spot pieces of the original kogyaru look, remixed into modern streetwear. Cropped hoodies instead of cardigans, and platform sneakers instead of loafers. Different silhouette, same instinct. Take the required uniform and make it say something about who you actually are. What started as a handful of teenage girls quietly bending a dress code became one of the most commercially powerful youth movements in modern Japanese history. It's proof that sometimes the biggest cultural shifts don't start in a corporate meeting. They start with a pair of socks nobody was supposed to be wearing. If this kind of story is your thing, make sure you're subscribed. There's a lot more hidden Japanese cultural history where this came from, and I'm not done digging.